You could hear it, but if there were people interested in joining online, they are just allowed in right now. But I think that hopefully people are familiar with your work and are joining this conversation because they want to be part of this talk. So I don't think it makes sense for me to read your bio again, but I'd love for us to open up the conversation. If you are joining online, you can add your questions to the Q&A tab, and maybe I'll say this a few more times throughout, just in case we have people logging in at a later moment. Tim, I'd love for you to introduce, just get us started with a short introduction about the book and what you see maybe as a connection to the exhibition and this ongoing research here, Non-Extractive Architecture.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be able to join and talk a little bit about the ideas in the book. I'm looking to you to educate me a little bit on non-extractive architecture, but I do hope that there's sufficient there to kind of merit, I'm sure there will be, to merit an interesting conversation between us. So let me perhaps start by talking about the context for the book. You mentioned my work as an economics commissioner for the UK Sustainable Development Commission. That was kind of back in between 2004, 2011. And you know, at that point in time, it was sort of taken as read, really, that we could sort of solve our environmental problems and keep the existing system going. And in the commission, we set out to challenge or to explore whether that was true or not. And we did a lot of work thinking about what prosperity means, what progress means, how the economy is set up to deliver progress, and whether there is or isn't a kind of conflict between that expansionary vision of the economy and the finiteness of the planet. And Prosperity Without Growth, which was the book that you mentioned, was the outcome of that sort of almost 7-year inquiry, I suppose, but it was also the outcome of quite a lot of my own academic work over that period of time. And it essentially, it kind of, from the perspective of policy and statistics and economics, it was written initially as a report to the UK government. And it turned out to be a surprising book in many ways. First of all, because it wasn't intended as a book, it was intended as a report to government. Secondly, because government wasn't too pleased to receive that report, particularly as it was published in the middle of the financial crisis, when all the governments in the world were trying to get growth back again. And third, because its unexpected audience was so enormous. As you mentioned, it was translated into kind of 17 or 18 different languages around the world in some quite surprising places. And it showed me, I suppose, that this conversation around the economic system and the vision that we have of ourselves of progress as economic growth was something that actually, even though politicians didn't really want to talk about it, ordinary people wanted to talk about it a lot. And it was kind of, once I had sort of put my head above the parapet on that, I may have been shot down by a lot of politicians, but ordinary people actually flocked to that conversation. And they were people as varied as, 80-something-year-old veterans of the limits to growth debate back in the 1970s, to young radical economists who wanted a different kind of economics and were entering their undergraduate degrees, not finding it, and audiences as varied as community libraries in local villages to big financial institutions that were multinational. So that was a huge surprise to me, to find that it triggered such a big conversation. But in the years that since then, I guess a couple of things struck me about it. And the first was that I hadn't really written the book for those people. I'd written it for politicians and statisticians. And actually the ordinary people who flocked to that conversation don't spend their time immersed in policy prescriptions and economic graphs and figures. And so I wanted to write something, and I was encouraged by some of the people that I met to write something that was much more for a wider audience, something that was more accessible, something that talked about the ideas not so much in policy and statistical terms as in visionary terms, in terms of creativity and imagination, and even perhaps in terms of poetry and literature. And as I began to think about the 10 years or so between publication of Prosperity Without Growth and sitting down to write this book, another thing occurred to me, which was that for all of the rational arguments and solid science that I had put into that earlier book, and all of its careful policy prescriptions of things that policymakers could do to change the situation, very little of that had happened. And I began to understand, in a sense, that there was a deeper work that needed to be done, a more philosophical work. We had to go beneath the roots of our economic system and explore in particular the structures of capitalism itself and to question those. So really Post-Growth does both of those things. It writes in a language that is different from a policy language and hopefully more accessible. It goes deeper into the philosophical understanding of the roots of our myth of growth. And it does a third thing, which became increasingly important to me as well, which is to set out something of a positive vision for what comes after. So the primary thesis, in a way, of Post-Growth as a book is that the world after growth and after capitalism is in fact a richer place, not a poorer one. It's one which is more fulfilling, where there are more opportunities for us as human beings to flourish. But to get there, and this was the kind of invitation of the book, to get there, we need to engage collectively in a deeper conversation about the human condition, about who we are as beings and our relationship to the finite planet on which we live. So that's Post-Growth in a nutshell, from its kind of origins to its execution. And the only other thing perhaps to add is that as I was sitting down to write it, as I was sitting down to write Prosperity Without Growth, the financial crisis struck. As I was sitting down to write Post-Growth, the pandemic struck. And both of those things proved to be quite an important part of writing each of those books. And in particular, Post-Growth was informed, and the writing of it was informed, and the subjects and the way that I addressed the subjects was informed by the fact that we were going through an experience which had never happened in my lifetime, and indeed almost in the lifetime of my parents either. It was a moment that shifted our perspective, and that certainly finds its way into the book. So perhaps I just stop there and invite your questions.
Sure. Maybe I hand it over to Joseph to start us off, and then we'll open it up to the researchers. Joseph.
Well, yeah. No, I first of all, thank you so much, Tim. I mean, your book has really been, both of your books in a way, well, primarily the first, but now, of course, we're specifically looking at, having read the second, having conversation around that. But I'd just like to say that it was really inspirational also in terms of what we're doing in Venice and some of the topics that we're attempting to tackle there. And of course, as architects and as designers, our focus is on the built environment. And I thought it was very interesting the way that your book really sort of engages with a very special moment, a very specific moment of the pandemic, where in a way, I think the thing we all experienced was reality to some extent being put on hold. It's as though we had the opportunity to step back a little bit from everything that was certain and really reconsider our own, some really kind of existential questions. And the thing that it kind of, I found it quite amusing because, of course, while all of this, Italy was, of course, the place where there was first hit first and probably hit hardest in Europe. And so it was also the Italian government was the first that was called to respond, to kind of begin to think about what was going to, how this moment was going to translate into some sort of transformation of reality. And that happened actually kind of surprisingly quickly. Italy really kind of came up pretty swiftly with an initiative to really capture take advantage of the moment. And of course, when the negotiations began in Europe around the recovery fund and the disbursement of money, capital, in order to kind of rebuild post-pandemic, Italy immediately destined a very significant portion of that to reconstruction, so to kind of making its buildings more energy efficient. In other words, to things that directly involved the built environment. And with a very specific, it was very interesting because I mean, so far so good, but of course, there was a very specific and open conversation about how this was designed in order to stimulate growth. So there was kind of the question of growth was never really called into question. I mean, some political parties like Cinque Stelle, the Five Star Party, a little bit sort of kind of talking about the alternatives to growth, but kind of in the more mainstream political discourse, building equals growth, and growth is necessary. So we have to set about kind of rebooting the economy through the act of building. And in a way that was kind of going contrary to everything that we were trying to think about in Venice, and similarly to your this project, which for you started right as the pandemic was started, so did ours in Venice, and then we had to kind of postpone it a little bit. But in a way, this project has developed in exceptional circumstances. And kind of coming to my question was basically kind of throughout the history of modernity, architecture and construction has really been kind of synonymous. It's been kind of deeply entangled with this idea of growth. A kind of a prosperous economy is an economy that builds. And so, for example, a post-Second World War reconstruction, the Marshall Plan and so on was all about rebuilding in order to foster growth. And I was wondering whether you had for us any kind of specific references to what form this alternative could take in the context of in the context specifically of the field that we're interested in, like how can we think about a way of kind of transforming the built environment, transforming our cities, building without necessarily that being simply kind of almost like an excuse for just pumping money into the economy.
Yeah, I think a couple of things, I suppose, a couple of principles, if you like. Probably neither of them will be that surprising to you, but actually some work that we were doing when I was at the Sustainable Development Commission was looking at the question of community renovation and rejuvenation. And, you know, there was a lot of discussion at that time about pulling old stuff down and building new stuff on infills in cities and so on. And we did a piece of work there, which was led by my colleague, Professor Anne Power from the London School of Economics, which was looking at, in fact, different ways of approaching that task, largely through that idea of renovation and rejuvenation. So that sort of sense that, you know, buildings represent a part of our heritage. And at the community level, they're even more a part of the heritage because they're part of your everyday life. And that more could be gained, both in social and environmental terms, through that process of renovation and refurbishment than from the kind of tear it down, build it new and cheap strategy that was proving very popular at the time. So I think that's one of the senses, that sense of actually increasing the life of something that already is there, partly in order to preserve its social value to us, but also actually, as it turns out, to reduce the energy costs in particular of the tear down and use again process. And so that to me seems to be one of the strategies. And I draw that from the time that I was at the Sustainable Development Commission. And the other is one that I draw, actually, interestingly, from my son, who trained as an architect, at least in the early stages of his life, and actually, sadly, I think, has run away from it now. But for his kind of project, particularly his kind of final project at college stage, produced these designs which stemmed from something that I didn't even know was there in him, in a way, which was to create architectural designs that were integrally related to the environment itself, from which ways in which you were creating buildings that merged themselves into the environment. So these wonderful sort of kind of creations that drew on the particular form of the natural environment in which they're being built, and almost melted into them, was the sort of visual image that he played with. But he also played with the sort of images of the use of unconventional materials in those buildings in ways that sort of mirrored the permaculture movement, ways in which you are using materials that are from that natural environment and that could be returned to that natural environment as much as possible as well. So, you know, those two kind of principles, I think, are the ones that I would point to most obviously. And I think, you know, to some extent, both of those suffer from the logics of growth, because they are not intrinsically economically increasing activities. To refurbish something, to put love and care into something, tends to be labor intensive, and labor is at a high cost, and generally therefore at a lower return than a kind of almost automized tear it down and put it up cheap model of building. And equally the kind of returns that you can hope to gather from a model of architecture that situates itself inside the natural world are, in a sense, things that you can probably only afford in a prestige project. But actually, as community projects, they would make an awful lot of sense, because the social returns to them, community returns to them, and the function of those buildings themselves. One of the interesting things about Zach, my son's project, was the functionality of those buildings was often associated with the development of community goals. There was one which was a kind of retreat for people who were in need of it for mental health reasons. And there was another one which was a kind of creative retreat for people who wanted that space to think, to write, to create, to visualize, and to work in a different way. So it seems to me, you know, that in a way, one of those is they're both very community oriented. Both of them, to some extent, are regarded as niche when it comes to the built environment. And I think they both stand as a challenge to the growth-based model of tear it down and put it up cheap, which tends to dominate in too many places.
Just in response to that, I think it's, you may have heard that the Pritzker Prize this year the Pritzker Prize is kind of like the Oscars of architecture and the most important award. And this year it went to Lacaton Massal, which is a French practice that has actually really, to some extent, pioneered, at least as a practice of that level, the idea of refurbishing rather than building from scratch. And I think that that's also maybe a signal of a kind of a change in
shift
in perception also about what is acceptable and what architects can aspire to, because of course these kind of prizes send signals to a younger generation about what they should be tending towards. So absolutely agree.
And thank you so much for the conversation and really for being here. Also, I think one of my particular interest in the sense of architecture is when you talked initially in the book about language and how we are really not able to articulate against like growth all the time because we don't have the right tools and the right language. And I think one of the points related to it is how we use language also kind of as a weapon towards really growing more, or like some politicians, companies, and institutions really use terms that can sound innocent, like sustainability or community, towards something that it really is against that. So I really don't know if you have any thoughts on that, because particularly the architectural world really uses this to justify many of the growth.
Yeah, no, I think, you know, this is something that I've thought a lot about, this kind of use of language. You know, I think to me, when you begin to realize that the language of growth is not entirely rational, when you begin to see its prevalence in society, when you begin to see it used to justify any move or to excuse any action, or indeed just to signal that you belong to the club of people who believe in growth, then you begin to see that it has a kind of almost religious quality, that it's not entirely a rational thing. There are rational arguments for growth and rational arguments against it, but a lot of the way in which that language is used is in part a signal that you're part of that club that believes in this vision of progress and this way of organizing society. And I remember distinct times, for example, just after or between the financial crisis and the pandemic, for example, where the government here, the Prime Minister kind of announced one day how he was going to, put the whole government on a war footing, and every department was to become a department of growth. And when you think about what those departments were doing, some of them were looking after social care, some of them were looking after the environment, some of them were looking after our relationships to foreign countries. I mean, to turn all of that into kind of, your department is now a department of growth is a travesty of the idea of government. And at that point, you begin to realize that what you're dealing with is something, deeply cultural, and a language, a symbolism that actually has a power that goes beyond rationality and has this sort of tenor of being religious in its grasp, in its grip on us. And that's, I think, a point at which you need to I think you need to have a slightly different strategy. And it's a strategy that I have had even in places where it's very difficult to challenge that growth language. And that is to nuance language, not to go out and out against that growth language, but just to very subtly move away from it, so that you're not talking about growth, but you're talking about prosperity. So you're not talking about growth, you're talking about people's jobs. You're not talking about growth, you're talking about a better environment for people. So in this different ways of nuancing the language, the difficulty with religious language is that as soon as you signal that you don't believe in a religion, then people will not listen to your ideas. So in a way, it's kind of a stealth tactic to begin to subvert that religious language without coming directly at it, but instead finessing the way that you present things in ways that can't really be contradicted, because nobody can argue against jobs, nobody can argue against well-being in the population. Nobody can argue against the quality of your outputs. Nobody can argue against prosperity itself. And so by talking about those kinds of things, instead of talking about growth, we allow ourselves the creative freedom to free ourselves from that language and its power over us.
Yeah, maybe I'll just ask a question now, because it's somehow related to what Pablo just asked. Thank you again very much for your thoughts. And I was really inspired. And also, I'm not from the field of architecture, so I come from design, and also I work a lot with storytelling. And so my question would be more related to your, let's say, also work as a playwright, which I think it's also a very interesting combination of the different, let's say, knowledges that you bring forward. And I think somehow we were talking about how can we think of a language beyond the language of growth, or let's say outside of the language of growth. But I was also thinking about how do we create a narrative that is not the narrative of growth. And so I think I was listening to one of the interviews that you were given, and somehow you were also referring to this idea of redrawing the threads of an already existing narrative. And so for me, that's very interesting in a way, how to exit, let's say, this unilinear temporality of progress, which is also one of the, let's say, the basis of the narrative of growth. And I'm mostly thinking in terms of language, ideas, and figures that you bring forward also in the book. How do you envision, let's say, a narrative that mixes different temporalities and different ideas that maybe emerged in different times before us, or maybe after, we don't know.
Yeah, well, let's hope after. I mean, one of the ideas exactly is that these voices from the past, these countercultures in some sense, these languages that allow us to see ourselves differently are an enormous resource for us now in thinking ourselves out of our culture, because a culture is something that looks solid to you when you're inside it. It looks immutable. And we know, you know, from anthropology and from history and from sociology that nothing is immutable in that way. But actually, when you're inside it, it seems immutable. And actually, at that point, what you need are these countercultural resources to kind of rescue yourself, in a sense, from that illusion of solidity that prevents you from making change or even thinking about change. So that is indeed one of the things that I was trying to do in post-growth, was to, and I'm not sure that I consciously knew I was doing it until I was halfway through the journey at least, but essentially kind of looking to the people whose wisdom had inspired me at various points in my life, and bringing them together into a narrative that presented us with a kind of countercultural idea of where we're going, of who we are, of the values that inspire us, and of the possibilities for the future. And what was extraordinary about that process to me was how, once I started on it, how connected it became. And I began to realize, and the book to some extent reflects this, and it reflects my emergent process of realizing that the connected countercultural narrative is really connected. It almost felt like a kind of a web of ideas that had come through the most extraordinary people, you know, a Chinese sage from 2,500 years BC, a senator who wanted to be president in the US but was assassinated before he had the chance, a physicist in Austria, a philosopher in Germany, an activist in Kenya, planting trees and encouraging poor rural women in Kenya to plant trees. The ideas behind these people, the inspirations for their work and for their lives, and the inspirations that they brought to us, represent a kind of something much more solid than I imagined was there before I started. They represent something which really resonates at a level below our culture and informs our culture, but also informs the possibilities to escape from our culture. And that was, I think that speaks a little bit to the process that you're alluding to. And although it doesn't necessarily create a sort of unilinear narrative that's distinct, it's not like you're kind of changing trains in Milan Central Station from a train that had growth on it to a train that had post-growth on it. It's not as kind of instrumental as that in a way, but what it's doing is kind of creating a place where you can think about your journey differently and think about the resources for that journey and bring them into the conversation differently.
Hi. Thank you so much for I really enjoyed the conversation. And my question will be about care, about value of care. And because in the time of automation, and I think this shift is a very sensitive one, that's changing our mind, but also in the post-work society, post-capitalism, but still it's really hard to imagine because it looks like a very long way before we will actually start value care. And it will not, I don't want to call it a currency, but it will become an equal thing in our kind of our personal path, our development, I don't know, career, and not even career, but what we're doing. So I'm just thinking about how do you implement it in a architecture, of economics, how does it find its place, and what's it maybe as steps in the transaction?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. And interestingly, it is kind of the project that I have going forward. So I'm kind of speaking to embryonic ideas around the next book that I'm planning to write, which is around the care economy. And you know, I think you're absolutely right that those values have suffered under our vision of capitalism, and in some quite structural ways. You know, care is something that requires time. It is about human beings in the service of each other. And that is not something that you can, you know, make more productive in the way that you can make a manufacturing process more productive. You know, and actually when those professions are subject to productivity pressures, you lose the value of the activity itself very, very fast, because it is about time. It's about the time that we spend in service to each other. And I guess, you know, there are a couple of points to make about the structure of that. One is that sense of human service is an immediate casualty of the profit maximization under which capitalism motivates human behavior. So it misses the value of that time. And those professions, because they are labor intensive, are kind of things that capitalism wants to sort of do away with as much as possible. So retrieving the value of that care has to be about protecting the value of that time in the economy. And then the other thing about it, I guess, is that care happens as much outside the economy as it does inside the economy. And so protecting that time outside the economy also becomes an important thing to do. And there you can begin on both sides there, you can begin to think about, you know, real economic innovations, for example, inside the economy. If you want to protect the nature of time within that, you have to have a kind of wages policy that protects those people and values those people who are working within the care sector. And at the same time, you have to have mechanisms and structures which allow the flexibility for people to work in care outside of the formal economy, and for that not to mean that they suffer in terms of their status or their livelihood or the conditions of their work. And those are all things that you can talk about, you know, in policy terms, actually, in quite clear, definitive, pragmatic, meaningful ways in which you can protect the value of care both inside and outside the economy. And at the heart of it, and this is something I guess I'm coming back to in relation to architecture, is that question of time and how people and time and space relates to each other. So one of the things that's happened inside buildings, for example, and it's very clear, particularly in travel buildings, in stations, since we were on the theme of stations and airports and interchanges, is that they become places of commerce. They become places where if you're holding up people in relation to time, it's so that they can spend money in the outlets and the stores and the shops and the cafes and the restaurants and so on. Now, actually, cafes and restaurants I have a slightly different view of, because I think cafes and restaurants, and indeed spaces where people can sit, spaces where they can enjoy that time, spaces where that transit is not just a hurried journey from A to B punctuated by a shopping experience, but is actually the time spent in travel that actually contributes to the value and the virtue of that travel in the first place. And so this idea that those, and that's in fact how many of those spaces were created initially, particularly the big stations, that sense of space and that sense of people moving was given an architecture in which they could also rest. You know, there are stories, archetypal stories of people who wrote basically Nobel Prize winning papers sitting in stations in central London. And because that was a place that you could go and you could just be, and you could just, yes, there were people moving around you, but the space itself was built for being in and staying in rather than just passing through or just shopping. And so I think that, you know, that interface between time and service and the space in which those things happen is really a kind of core vision for a different kind of way of thinking about the built environment and about architecture.
if they don't have one, I can. It's just that I'm going to change the topic completely. So I don't know. Okay. Thank you, Tim, again for making the time to join us today. I kind of want to go back to the discussion on the pandemic, because I think you made some very interesting points in the book about how this moment kind of transported society to a post-growth world, kind of showing us that it is possible for the government to intervene to the health of society, kind of against the logics of money itself. But I think what I wanted to talk about is more, I felt like your points were more focused in the Northern Hemisphere in general. And I would just like to discuss how developing countries were affected differently during this period, and how the inequalities between countries were increased, and what kind of strategies could we think about in a post-growth world to avoid that, or kind of bridge those gaps.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting point, and the evidence from the work that I did, in Prosperity Without Growth, is actually kind of very clear that there are parts of the world and parts of our communities where an increase in income, so growth in the other words, is absolutely essential, and where the outcomes, the sort of prosperity benefits of that growth are very clear. And in the poorest countries in the world, you get a massive increase in life expectancy from having, your income rising from next to nothing to around about $15,000 per capita. You get a massive reduction in infant mortality and maternal morbidity. You get massive increase in participation in education. You get an increase in measured happiness. All of these things happen at low, as low incomes are increased. And that's not to say that the developing countries should or shouldn't just go with that growth-based model. And I've been quite surprised actually in some of my work, which I have to say, broadly speaking, was written for the so-called advanced economies. It was written from the perspective of a kind of responsibility for us in the richest economies to develop a different model of what progress means, because it partly in order to make space for that material progress that has to happen in poorer countries. But I've nonetheless been quite surprised at how, in some of those countries, those conversations about a different way of approaching the economy and a different way of approaching the society and escaping the downsides of capitalism and expansionary growth could actually have benefits in those poorer countries. But I think primarily I would answer your question by suggesting, that there's a leveling up agenda which has to take a priority in this post-growth world, and that we have to be looking for those opportunities where, the very opposite of that dogma that I described earlier, in which our Prime Minister encouraged the Foreign Office to be a growth-oriented Foreign Office. In other words, growth opportunities for the UK through its foreign aid dispositions. And instead, actually, for those places where, in recognition of a moral responsibility for a different sort of progress, we are providing support to those poorest parts of the world. And the mechanisms like the fund that the world leaders are trying to put together next week or the week after in Glasgow under the Conference of Parties for the Climate Change Convention is exactly the sort of mechanism that we might be talking about there. In some senses, it is just a fund. It's the ability to provide the funding that developing countries need to develop, first of all, the basic conditions and necessities of life, because that's where prosperity really increases with income. And second, the ability to invest in the infrastructures for their communities to develop in a different way. So it's not a particularly kind of in-depth analysis of the implications for the global South, for want of a better word. But it's a sense actually that our responsibility to the global South consists partly in recognizing our own responsibility to develop a different model, and secondly, in providing resources in those places where it makes an enormous difference to the quality of life. And doing both of those things without imposing what would be the biggest danger of all, which would be a kind of new form of colonialism, which is imposing northern ideas on poorer countries yet again.
Great, thank you. I know we're sort of running near the end of your time with us, but I wanted to just ask a little bit about network and audience. One of the things that we're really trying to do with this project here at V-A-C Zattere is initiate and begin forming and growing a network of people, of policymakers, economists, material scientists, designers, all working towards this idea of what non-extractive architecture could be. Or already is. And recently we had a conference and we were talking about this initiative and how we were trying to bring in all these different voices, and we're also really how the future of this project could be then go on to government offices and influence policy. And someone in the audience asked, but who in the audience here is working in policy or government? And of course, everyone in the audience was an architect. And I think I was wondering, since your book so successfully was able to reach, like you said, both people working in economics and policy, and also a really general audience of 17 different languages that it was translated into. How do you have any tips for us on how we can bring a work like this, and how we can connect with different networks and bring it to higher institutions and spaces of power that are not just our own bubble?
Yeah. I don't have any instant sort of silver bullet, I have to say. I mean, it's a really good question to ask, and there's no clear strategy for it. I mean, I've worked at that interface for my whole professional life. First, when I was essentially in a kind of campaigning organization, an NGO, non-governmental organization, and then more recently as an academic, and then in the middle of all that as an advisory body to the government itself. And what's really interesting is that in all of those cases, there was no obvious, linear, guaranteed way of creating influence and power. And I began to feel, to some extent, that our most obvious routes of sort of saying, well, we do the work, we talk about it, and then we expect people to listen to it in power and change, that so rarely happens. And you have to kind of, you have to look for your opportunities where you can amplify that voice for some reason, or you can intervene in the policy process. And that question of intervening in the policy process, I mean, architecture and building and the economy generally is always subject to an ongoing process of legislation, regulation, and to some extent policy strategy. And so being prepared to undertake the painstaking work of engaging in those processes is one of the obvious things that you have to do. And it is painstaking. I kind of liken the process of having policy influence. My research group, CUSP, is the secretariat for an all-party parliamentary group in the UK government, and we've held that position essentially between research and policy for 5 or 6 years now. But the progress is desperately incremental. It's like you're climbing up a rock face, and coming down at you while you try to make progress upwards are avalanches and waterfalls, and other people climbing down over you, and other people trying to get past you to get to the top. And you almost literally have to think about it in those terms of creating your ground by slowly moving step by step and anchoring yourself as firmly as you can on the rock place, so you're not flooded off by some other agenda. So that's kind of step one, if you like, is to be prepared to engage in that process. Not with an expectation that it's easy, but with an expectation that, and here's kind of step two, every now and then something surprising happens. Every now and then you'll be in the right place at a time to make a difference. And every now and then you'll find a set of circumstances that open a door that you hadn't expected to open. And then you're there and you're ready. And being sort of strategic about that, being creative about that, finding also the avenues that affect policy by appealing to ordinary people. And there's nothing quite so appealing to a politician as knowing that his own constituents are in favor of something. So being able to gather that appeal in the community as well as directly in policy is another way of intervening in that process, of influencing that process. None of it, as I say, is predictable or easy, but in a sense, all of it is worth engaging in. So, you know, wherever you find those opportunities and wherever you have that energy, it's always worth doing.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think it goes back also to what you were saying a little while ago of just reaching out to the wisdom of your network, of the people around you, that and building this further. I wonder if you have one more question. We'll wrap it up with just a few last questions.
So in your talking, I was reminded of a quote from John Maynard Keynes, in which he said, "The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Practical men who believe themselves to be exempt from any intellectual influences are usually slaves of some defunct economist." And I mean, it's impressive to see the effort here to focus on sustainable architecture, but in some sense, it is in order for policy to create this as a common goal requires economists who make this a necessity for policymakers and for investors of capital.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think though that we have to be careful to distinguish between two different things. One is the slave to some dead economist, you know, really those old economic ideas still having purchase in policy, which is clearly there and clearly something to be fought against in a way. And the other is the use of economics to excuse vested interests, which are really only informing the betterment of a minority of people who are working in and to some extent corrupting government in pursuit of their own interests. And so, you know, those two things are very definitely going on. Interestingly, Keynes, at another point, I think, said standing between us and the new economics is only a few, I can't remember how he said, old fools in frock coats who would be, once you actually confront them, they'll be blown down in an instant, and they might even enjoy being blown down in the process, which does suggest that, you know, one of those problems, the problem of being slave to some dead economist, is something that can have a momentum of its own and can run like a breath of fresh air through government and have its impact on policy and doing things in different ways. But the other one is a struggle. And I think, you know, in some sense, it's worth distinguishing those two things, that the old ideas which need blowing away and the vested interests of the present which need challenging, and having slightly different tactics for each of those challenges.
Great. I think that's a nice image of the old ways blowing away to end on. And I just want to say again, thank you so much for your time and joining us even remotely. It's been great to have you as part of this conversation and adding to this growing network that we're trying to form here. So we really, like Joseph said, both books have been really inspirational to this project, and we really thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Have a nice night, and
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye.
to the guests for joining us as well. Bye.
Bye.